Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill was born on November 30, 1874, at Blenheim Palace, the magnificent estate of his grandfather, the 7th Duke of Marlborough. From the beginning, his life was intertwined with British history and aristocracy. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was a prominent conservative politician destined for greatness. His mother, Jennie Jerome, was an American socialite known for her beauty, intelligence, and charm. Yet despite the glamour surrounding his birth, Winston's early years were not warm or affectionate. His parents were often absent. His father was consumed by politics, and his mother by social life. The young boy spent most of his childhood in the care of his beloved nanny, Mrs. Elizabeth Everest, whom he later called his dearest and most intimate friend. Even as a child, Winston was restless, curious, and defiant. At St. George's School in Ascot, he struggled to concentrate, often getting into trouble. His academic performance was poor, and his teachers labeled him unmanageable. But inside that mischievous child burned a fierce independence and a powerful imagination. He loved history, war stories, and toy soldiers, spending hours recreating famous battles on the floor of his nursery. His father was disappointed, often calling him stupid and hopeless. Winston would later write that he longed for his father's approval but rarely received it. This emotional distance, though painful, planted in him a deep determination, a desire to prove himself to the world. Churchill's formal education continued at Harrow School, one of England's most prestigious institutions. At first, he was near the bottom of his class. He disliked Latin and Greek but found comfort in English literature and history. His teachers noticed his gift for language and his flair for expression, especially in writing and public speaking. It was at Harrow that Winston began to show signs of leadership. He joined the fencing team and won several prizes. His classmates often laughed at his stubbornness, but they also admired his courage. He once said, "I do not like being told I cannot do something." That defiant spirit would define his entire life. Despite his struggles, Winston eventually passed the entrance exams to the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst on his third attempt. It was not an easy journey, but his perseverance paid off. At Sandhurst, he finally found his place, a world of discipline, courage, and competition. He studied tactics, fortifications, and military strategy with passion. Graduating 8th in his class of 150 in 1894. The boy once dismissed as a failure was now on the path to becoming a soldier and, eventually, one of history's greatest leaders. In 1895, at just 21, Winston Churchill joined the British Army as a second lieutenant in the 4th Queen's Own Hussars. But he was not content with a quiet military career. He wanted excitement and recognition. That same year, tragedy struck. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, died at only 45. Winston, devastated but determined, promised himself that he would fulfill the ambitions his father never achieved. He finished in glory. I will finish in glory too, he wrote. Winston's first military postings were adventurous. In Cuba, he observed the Spanish army fighting local rebels, writing newspaper reports to earn extra money. His vivid writing style soon attracted attention. He described battles not only with accuracy but with drama, capturing the emotion and chaos of war. He later served in India, where he read history and philosophy for hours every day. Plato, Gibbon, Macaulay, and Schopenhauer filled his evenings. I had a university education at my own expense, he joked later. His reputation as both a soldier and journalist grew after he joined the Malakand Field Force on the Indian frontier in 1897. His bravery under fire earned him a medal, and his first book, The Story of the Malakand Field Force, published in 1898. Soon after, he went to the Sudan, where he participated in the famous Battle of Omdurman, 1898. One of the last great cavalry charges in history. There, he witnessed the brutal power of modern warfare, the deadly effect of machine guns against brave but poorly armed tribesmen. He wrote, "It was not a battle, but an execution." Churchill's vivid accounts made him famous, but also controversial. Some officers resented his ambition and publicity-seeking. Yet, Winston knew one thing. His destiny was not to remain a soldier, but to become a statesman. In 1899, Churchill resigned his commission to enter politics, but fate had another adventure planned. When the Second Boer War broke out in South Africa, he went there as a war correspondent for the Morning Post. While accompanying an armored train, he was captured by Boer forces. The news spread quickly. The young Englishman, already known for his daring, was now a prisoner of war. But Churchill refused to remain one night. With only biscuits and chocolate in his pockets, he climbed over a prison wall in Pretoria and escaped. For days, he wandered through hostile territory, hiding in the bush, guided by luck and courage. Finally, he reached safety after finding refuge with a British sympathizer, a coal mine manager named John Howard. Churchill's escape became front-page news. In London, he was hailed as a hero. When he finally returned home, he was a national celebrity, the daring young man who had defied capture and crossed hundreds of miles to freedom. It was the perfect moment to enter politics. In 1900, at 25, Churchill was elected to Parliament as the Conservative member for Oldham. But from the start, his independence clashed with party loyalty. He was a born rebel, too bold, too outspoken, and too unwilling to conform. Disillusioned by the rigid thinking of his party, Churchill crossed the floor to join the Liberal Party in 1904, a shocking move at the time. He believed in social reform, free trade, and progress. His speeches were fiery, his intellect sharp, and his ambition unstoppable. By 1908, he had risen rapidly. He was appointed president of the Board of Trade in the government of Prime Minister Herbert Asquith, becoming one of the youngest cabinet ministers in British history. He introduced reforms for workers' rights, unemployment insurance, and fair wages, early signs of his deep concern for ordinary citizens. That same year, he married Clementine Hosier, a bright and strong-willed woman who would become his lifelong partner and emotional anchor. Their marriage, based on mutual respect and affection, endured through triumphs and trials for over 50 years. Churchill's star was rising, but his career was about to face its first great test. As First Lord of the Admiralty, Churchill was responsible for preparing Britain's navy for modern warfare. He foresaw the importance of new technologies, submarines, aircraft, and oil-powered ships, and pushed for modernization. When World War I broke out in 1914, Churchill threw himself into action. He organized the defense of the English Channel and the Royal Navy's support of the British Expeditionary Force. But his ambitious plan to open a new front by attacking Turkey at Gallipoli ended in disaster. Thousands of soldiers died in the failed campaign, and Churchill was blamed for the tragedy. His reputation collapsed overnight. In 1915, he resigned from the government. For a man who had always craved success, it was a devastating blow. Yet, true to his nature, he refused to despair. "I am finished," he told his wife, "but I will begin again." After resigning, Churchill did something few politicians would dare. He joined the army again, serving on the Western Front. He commanded a battalion of the Royal Scots Fusiliers. He lived among his men, sharing the mud and fear of the trenches. His time in the war changed him deeply. He saw the horror of modern conflict and the suffering of ordinary soldiers. But it also restored his sense of purpose. In 1917, Churchill was invited back to government by Prime Minister David Lloyd George, who valued his energy and intellect. He became Minister of Munitions, then Secretary of State for War, and later Secretary for Air. He worked tirelessly to modernize Britain's armed forces. However, his aggressive stance against strikes and his opposition to socialism made him many enemies. By the early 1920s, his popularity had faded again. When the Liberals lost power, Churchill lost his seat. He was politically isolated, neither fully conservative nor fully liberal. In 1924, Churchill rejoined the Conservative Party, the very group he had left 2 decades earlier. Many viewed him as an opportunist. But Churchill saw it differently. He believed that political principles mattered more than party labels. He was appointed Chancellor of the Exchequer under Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, responsible for managing Britain's finances. His decision to return Britain to the gold standard at pre-war rates was controversial and later criticized for hurting exports and increasing unemployment. After the Conservatives lost power in 1929, Churchill found himself out of office and politically isolated. His opposition to Indian self-government, and his outdated views on the empire, alienated many colleagues. The public began to see him as a man whose time had passed. But while others ignored him, Churchill spent his wilderness years writing, painting, and reflecting. He produced historical books, gave lectures around the world, and continued to speak in Parliament, warning, time and again, that Europe was heading toward danger. The 1930s were a dark time in Europe. Adolf Hitler had risen to power in Germany, and the Nazi regime was rearming at an alarming rate. Churchill, almost alone, saw the threat clearly. While most politicians believed in appeasement, Churchill thundered from the backbenches, "We are entering a period of consequences." He demanded stronger defenses and alliances to deter Germany. Yet, his warnings were dismissed as the ramblings of an old warmonger. Newspapers mocked him. Even friends turned away. Still, Churchill persisted. He read intelligence reports, met informants, and gathered evidence that Britain was unprepared for war. His speeches in Parliament grew increasingly urgent. The era of procrastination, of half measures, of soothing and baffling expedients is coming to a close. We are entering a period of consequences. When Hitler invaded Poland in September 1939, Churchill's predictions proved horribly correct. The world was at war again, and Britain turned once more to the man who had seen it coming. As soon as war began, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain appointed Churchill as First Lord of the Admiralty, the same position he had held in the First World War. When Churchill arrived, the Admiralty sent out a simple message to all ships: "Winston is back." Under his leadership, the Navy sprang into action. He brought energy, urgency, and defiance. But as the months passed and Britain suffered military setbacks, the country lost faith in Chamberlain. The need for a new leader became undeniable. In May 1940, as Nazi Germany invaded France and the Low Countries, Chamberlain resigned. After much debate, Winston Churchill, once ridiculed and rejected, was chosen as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. When Churchill took office on May 10, 1940, Britain faced its darkest hour. France was collapsing, Europe was overrun, and the threat of Nazi invasion loomed. Standing before the House of Commons, Churchill delivered one of the most powerful speeches in history. "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat." He promised only struggle and endurance, and the British people responded with faith. He formed a coalition government, uniting all parties to fight the common enemy. Each night, London shook under the bombs of the Blitz, but Churchill's words lifted morale. "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall never surrender." The world began to see him not just as a politician, but as the living symbol of Britain's defiance. When France fell in June 1940, Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. Hitler prepared an invasion, but first he needed control of the skies. The Royal Air Force, outnumbered and exhausted, fought day after day against the Luftwaffe. Churchill visited airfields, spoke with pilots, and witnessed their bravery. When victory finally came, he said, Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. His leadership during the Battle of Britain transformed him into a global hero. But Churchill knew the war was far from over. Britain still stood isolated, and supplies were running dangerously low. Only one nation could save them: the United States. Churchill understood that Britain's survival depended on American support. He built a close friendship with President Franklin D. Roosevelt, communicating through letters, cables, and secret meetings. When the U.S. Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act, America began sending ships, weapons, and supplies to Britain. Churchill called it the most unsordid act in the history of any nation. In December 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and America entered the war. Churchill immediately traveled to Washington. Standing beside Roosevelt, he declared, "Now we are all in the same boat, together." It was the beginning of one of the greatest wartime partnerships in history. The war spread across the world: North Africa, the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, and the Pacific. Churchill coordinated strategy with Roosevelt and Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, creating what became known as the Grand Alliance. But victory came slowly. British forces suffered defeats in Singapore and Tobruk. At home, cities burned under air raids. Rationing, loss, and exhaustion tested the nation's endurance. Still, Churchill's voice carried them through. You ask, what is our aim? I can answer in one word: victory, victory at all costs. By late 1942, the tide began to turn. British troops under General Montgomery defeated Rommel's forces at El Alamein. Churchill rejoiced. Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat. As the Allies gained ground, Churchill traveled endlessly to Cairo, Tehran, Casablanca, and Quebec, meeting Roosevelt and Stalin to plan the final assault on Nazi Europe. He played the diplomat and strategist, balancing the ambitions of the Americans and Russians while fighting to preserve Britain's influence. He worked late into the night, smoking cigars and dictating letters to his secretaries. In 1944, the Allies prepared for Operation Overlord, the invasion of France. Churchill longed to land with the troops but was forbidden by the generals. He watched from afar as the D-Day landings began on June 6, 1944. Britain's finest hour was finally bearing fruit. On May 8, 1945, Nazi Germany surrendered. Crowds filled the streets of London, waving flags and cheering for Churchill. Standing on the balcony of the Ministry of Health, he looked over the sea of faces and said simply, "This is your victory." He had led Britain through its darkest days to triumph. Yet, within weeks, the war hero faced a shocking turn of fate. In the general election of July 1945, the people, weary from years of war, voted Churchill out of office. The Labour Party, led by Clement Attlee, won by a landslide. Churchill accepted defeat with grace, saying, "The people have the right to choose, and they have chosen." but the loss wounded him deeply. Though out of power, Churchill remained a global voice. He warned of a new threat, the growing power of the Soviet Union. In a 1946 speech at Fulton, Missouri, he declared, "An iron curtain has descended across the continent." These words defined the Cold War. He urged the Western nations to unite against totalitarianism and preserve freedom. During this period, Churchill also began writing his monumental 6-volume history, The Second World War, which would later win him the Nobel Prize in Literature. Through his words, he preserved the story of Britain's courage and his own vision of history. In 1951, at the age of 76, Churchill returned to office as Prime Minister. Though older and less energetic, his mind remained sharp. He focused on foreign policy, promoting peace and rebuilding Britain's role in the post-war world. He dreamed of a united Europe, saying, "We must build a kind of United States of Europe." However, his health began to fail. He suffered a stroke in 1953 but recovered enough to continue working. That same year, he received the Nobel Prize in Literature for his historical and biographical writings. In 1955, realizing that his time had come to step aside, he resigned as Prime Minister, ending more than half a century in public life. Even after leaving office, Churchill remained an influential figure. He continued to write, paint, and receive visitors at his home in Chartwell, in Kent. He often painted landscapes of the English countryside, peaceful scenes that contrasted with the turmoil of his political life. His paintings became widely admired for their warmth and color. Though age slowed him, his wit remained sharp. When a young journalist once asked what qualities a politician needed most, Churchill replied dryly, "The ability to foretell what will happen tomorrow, next week, next month, and next year, and the ability afterwards to explain why it didn't happen." Churchill spent his later years reflecting on the lessons of leadership. He believed courage was the foundation of all virtues, moral, intellectual, and political. He often said, "Success is not final, failure is not fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts." He had known both triumph and defeat, yet he never surrendered to bitterness. He valued humor, humanity, and perseverance above all. In his final years, Churchill's health declined steadily. He suffered several strokes and grew increasingly frail. Yet he remained mentally alert and aware of his place in history. The nation he had defended so fiercely now revered him as a legend. Visitors described him sitting quietly by the fire, wrapped in a blanket, gazing out over the gardens of Chartwell. On January 24, 1965, exactly 70 years after his father's death, Winston Churchill passed away at the age of 90. The world mourned. His funeral was attended by kings, presidents, and prime ministers, a fitting tribute to a man who had changed history. Churchill's funeral, held at St. Paul's Cathedral, was one of the largest in British history. Over 300,000 people filed past his coffin as it lay in state. As his body was carried down the Thames, cranes along the river's edge dipped in silent salute. The world stood still. He was buried in Blaydon churchyard, near his beloved Blenheim Palace, where his life had begun 90 years earlier. Churchill's legacy endures as one of unbreakable courage. He was far from perfect, impulsive, stubborn, and sometimes wrong, but when the fate of civilization hung in the balance, he rose to meet it. He embodied the spirit of resistance. When others would have yielded, he stood firm. His leadership gave the world time to breathe, to fight back, and to win. Generations have since looked to him as a symbol of determination in the face of overwhelming odds. Beyond politics, Churchill was a man of words and imagination. His books, From Marlborough, His Life and Times to a History of the English-Speaking Peoples, showed his deep love for history and heritage. He wrote not merely to record events, but to give them meaning. His command of language, his rhythm, and his sense of destiny made him one of the greatest writers-statesmen of all time. When asked how he would like to be remembered, Churchill replied simply, "I was, perhaps, the greatest Briton of my age. Few would disagree." More than half a century after his death, Churchill's voice still echoes. His speeches continue to inspire those who face fear, doubt, or adversity. He taught the world that leadership is not about perfection, but perseverance, not about never falling, but about always rising again. Winston Churchill lived a life of extraordinary struggle and triumph. From his lonely childhood to the highest office in the land, he carried one belief: that destiny belongs to the brave. And so, history remembers him not just as a politician or warrior, but as a man who gave hope when the world needed it most. "Courage is rightly esteemed the first of human qualities," he once wrote, "because it is the quality which guarantees all others."